The Duke never looked at his bride. Not once. Not while she walked down the aisle. Not while she said her vows. Not even when the priest declared them husband and wife. Instead, Duke Charles Ellis signed the marriage register, closed the book, and quietly said 6 words that changed Daisy Charlton's life forever. "Blackthorne Hall is yours. Goodbye." Then he walked out of the church. The guests froze. The orchestra stopped. Even the priest forgot to breathe. The new Duchess stood alone beside the altar while her husband climbed into his carriage and disappeared down the road. 3 hours later, Daisy arrived at Blackthorne Hall, a mansion so silent it seemed to have been abandoned by happiness itself. The windows were shuttered. The gardens had died. An ancient clock in the entrance hall had stopped 7 years earlier, at precisely 11 minutes past 8. And upstairs, someone had locked an entire wing of the house. But that wasn't the strangest thing. Because hidden inside Blackthorne Hall was a secret so devastating that it had broken a duke. And months later, when Charles Ellis finally returned, he would discover that the woman he had abandoned had uncovered everything. And nothing, not his title, not his wealth, not even his guarded heart, would ever be the same again. Before we step through the doors of Blackthorne Hall, tell us where you're listening from. Because if old mansions could talk, this one would probably ask for therapy. Watch, enjoy the story, and please subscribe. Reaching 1,000 subscribers means the world to me, and your support makes this happen. Daisy Charlton had spent 26 years learning one lesson. People leave. Her father died in debt. Her relatives vanished when the money disappeared. Suitors looked through her as if she were invisible. And now, the Duke who had married her had abandoned her before the wedding flowers had even wilted. Any sensible woman would have cried. Any sensible woman would have packed her trunk and left. But Daisy Charlton had never been particularly sensible, because when she stepped inside Blackthorne Hall and felt the sadness trapped inside those walls, she made herself one promise. She would not disappear, not for a duke, not for loneliness, not for ghosts. If Blackthorne Hall had been abandoned, then she would bring it back to life. She did not know that every curtain she opened, every room she restored, every dusty ledger she touched, was leading her toward a secret someone had buried for 7 years. A secret involving a missing child, a fortune being stolen, and a betrayal so cruel that it would bring an entire aristocratic family to its knees. Daisy Charlton did not cry at her wedding. She had done enough crying in her life already. She stood perfectly still beneath the towering stained glass windows of St. Ethelreda's church, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, while whispers traveled through the pews like restless ghosts. Poor Daisy Charlton, the penniless gentlewoman, the Duke's obligation, the bride nobody envied. Daisy heard every word. She simply chose not to acknowledge them. Across the altar stood Duke Charles Ellis, 8th Duke of Blackthorne. He was devastatingly handsome. Everyone said so. Tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, possessed of the sort of aristocratic beauty that inspired poetry in debutantes and reckless decisions in widows. At this particular moment, however, Daisy thought he looked less like a bridegroom and more like a man attending an unpleasant business meeting. He had not looked at her once, not when she entered the church, not during the vows, not even when she placed her trembling hand into his. He stared straight ahead, his expression carved from cold stone. There was history behind that expression, pain, loss, something older and heavier than mere indifference. But Daisy did not know the details, only rumors that 7 years earlier, tragedy had visited Blackthorne Hall, rumors that afterward, the Duke had abandoned his ancestral home, rumors that no woman had managed to draw him back, and now he was marrying, not for love, not for companionship, for duty. The Archbishop cleared his throat. If anyone can show just cause why these two persons may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. Heavy, expectant. No one spoke. No one dared. The ceremony proceeded. Daisy repeated her vows calmly. Charles repeated his with flawless precision. When it was over, they signed the register. Daisy signed first. Her handwriting remained steady. Charles signed second. His was quick, efficient, almost impatient. Then, at last, he looked at her. For the first time. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, beautiful, exhausted, and profoundly sad. "Blackthorne Hall is yours," he said quietly. 6 words, no congratulations, no welcome, no promises. Then he added, "Goodbye." Before Daisy could answer, he turned, walked down the aisle, walked out of the church, and left. The entire congregation froze. Lady Percival dropped her fan. The organist stopped playing mid-note. Even the archbishop appeared personally offended. Daisy remained standing beside the altar, alone, the newly married Duchess of Blackthorne, abandoned in under 10 minutes. There was a pause, long enough for pity to begin gathering in the room. Daisy despised pity. She lifted her chin, turned gracefully, and walked down the aisle by herself. If she noticed the whispers, she gave no indication. Outside, an enormous black carriage awaited. An elderly footman opened the door. "Your Grace." Daisy climbed inside. "To Blackthorne Hall?" she asked. "Yes, Your Grace." The carriage began moving, and with every mile, civilization seemed to retreat. London disappeared. Then villages. Then roads grew narrower. Fields gave way to woodland. By late afternoon, rain had begun. A soft, relentless rain. Daisy watched droplets race down the carriage window and considered her circumstances. She was now a duchess, a title she had never wanted, married to a man she barely knew, transported to an estate she had never seen, entirely alone. Objectively speaking, it was not an ideal beginning. Her lips twitched. Objectively speaking, it was catastrophic. Still, catastrophes could be managed, provided one remained calm. As twilight descended, the carriage finally slowed. Iron gates emerged from the mist. 2 immense stone pillars marked the entrance. Blackthorne Hall. The letters had nearly vanished beneath ivy. The gates creaked open. The carriage rolled forward. Daisy pressed one hand against the glass. The estate stretched endlessly. Ancient oaks lined the drive, their branches intertwining overhead like clasped fingers. The grounds had once been magnificent. She could still see it. Formal gardens, fountains, terraces, all swallowed by neglect. The house itself appeared moments later, and Daisy forgot to breathe. Blackthorne Hall was enormous. 3 stories of pale stone and soaring windows. Towers rose against the darkening sky. Terraces overlooked rolling countryside. It should have looked majestic. Instead, it looked abandoned. Most of the shutters were closed. No lights shone from the upper floors. The gardens had become wilderness. The entire house possessed the peculiar stillness of places left grieving for too long. The carriage stopped. Silence settled. The footman lowered her trunk onto the gravel. No one else appeared. No welcoming committee, no servants, no husband, nothing. Daisy stepped onto the drive. Rain dampened her bonnet immediately. She looked toward the house. For one strange moment, she had the extraordinary sensation that Blackthorne Hall was watching her, assessing her, deciding something. Then the front door opened. An elderly woman appeared, small, straight-backed, severe, silver hair, sharp eyes. She descended the steps with military precision. "Your Grace," she said. Her tone suggested uncertainty rather than welcome. Daisy inclined her head. "You must be the housekeeper." "I am Mrs. Agatha Finch." A pause. "You were expected." Daisy noticed she had not said welcomed. There was a difference. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." Mrs. Finch looked at her carefully. "You've had a long journey." "Yes." "Will His Grace be joining us?" Daisy answered honestly. "No." Mrs. Finch's expression changed, not surprise, resignation, as though she had expected exactly that. "Very well," Mrs. Finch said. "Come inside." Daisy crossed the threshold and immediately understood something important. Blackthorne Hall was not merely empty, it was frozen. Dust lingered everywhere. Furniture stood draped in white sheets. Entire corridors lay in darkness. An enormous grandfather clock dominated the entrance hall. It had stopped. The hands remained fixed. 8:11. Mrs. Finch noticed Daisy staring. It stopped 7 years ago. Why was it never repaired? The older woman hesitated. His Grace instructed us not to touch it. 7 years. Daisy looked around again. No flowers, no music, no warmth, no life. The house had not simply been neglected. It had been abandoned deliberately, as though someone had locked away every happy memory and thrown away the key. Mrs. Finch led her toward the staircase. The east wing has been prepared for you. The east wing? The remainder of the house is closed. Closed? Yes, Your Grace. Something in Mrs. Finch's voice discouraged further questions. For now. Daisy climbed the staircase slowly. At the landing, she glanced down. The entrance hall stretched below in shadows. The stopped clock remained motionless. 8:11. 8:11. 8:11. A house trapped in time. As Mrs. Finch opened the Duchess's bedchamber, Daisy made herself a promise. She would not disappear here, no matter what had happened inside these walls, no matter why the Duke had left, no matter how lonely this place became. She would endure. Because someone had once loved Blackthorne Hall, she could feel it, and perhaps, if houses remembered love, they could remember life as well. Later that night, long after Mrs. Finch retired and the household had fallen silent, Daisy lay awake listening to rain strike the windows. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Directly above her room. Daisy sat upright. Impossible. Mrs. Finch had said the upper floor was closed. The footsteps came again. 1, 2, 3, and suddenly stopped, directly over her bed. Daisy stared at the ceiling, wide awake, because she had the unmistakable feeling that she was not alone in Blackthorne Hall. Daisy Charlton did not scream. This was partly because she possessed excellent self-control, and partly because she had spent most of her life discovering that screaming rarely improved difficult situations. So when she heard footsteps directly above her bed in a supposedly empty wing of Blackthorne Hall, she merely sat very still beneath the covers and listened. Rain whispered against the windows. The fire in her grate crackled softly, and overhead, silence, complete silence. Daisy waited another 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing. No more footsteps, no doors opening, no voices, no movement. Eventually, reason reasserted itself. Old houses settled, wood expanded, ancient pipes groaned. Surely Blackthorne Hall, a house large enough to contain an entire village, was entitled to make a few unsettling noises. Precisely, Daisy whispered aloud. Speaking aloud made the room feel less lonely. Unfortunately, it also revealed that she was speaking to herself. She sighed. This is an excellent beginning to married life. Sleep eventually claimed her. Morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight. Daisy awoke to birdsong. For several confused seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she opened her eyes. The unfamiliar room, the carved canopy bed, the enormous fireplace, the silent house. Memory returned. She was Duchess of Blackthorne, and her husband had abandoned her. A remarkable accomplishment for a marriage not yet 24 hours old. Daisy dressed herself. She had always preferred independence. Growing up with limited means left little room for helplessness. By 6:30, she was already exploring. The corridors outside her room stretched endlessly. Portraits lined the walls. Generations of dukes and duchesses watched her pass. Most appeared stern. One looked actively disappointed. Daisy paused before a portrait of an elegant woman seated in a garden. She was breathtakingly beautiful, dark-haired, gentle-eyed. There was warmth in her expression, life. The plaque beneath the painting read, Evelina Ellis, Duchess of Blackthorne. No dates, no explanation, only a name. Daisy suspected immediately. The first Duchess, the wife Charles had lost. She studied the portrait for a long moment. The woman looked kind and profoundly loved. That kind of love left ruins behind when it ended. Daisy knew that much. She continued downstairs. The dining room was closed, so was the music room. The ballroom doors had been locked. Every public room she encountered seemed untouched and unloved. Finally, she found the kitchen. Mrs. Finch looked startled. "Your Grace." "Good morning. You are awake early." "I dislike sleeping late." Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Most ladies in your position generally remain in bed for several days." There was meaning beneath the words. Daisy smiled faintly. "I'm afraid disappointment has never significantly affected my appetite." A surprised sound escaped Mrs. Finch, not quite laughter, but close. Progress. Cook entered carrying bread, a large, broad woman with flour on her cheek. "This is Mrs. Morwen Hale," Mrs. Finch said. Morwen curtsied. "Your Grace. Please call me Daisy when we're alone." The kitchen became silent. Mrs. Finch looked faintly alarmed. Morwen looked scandalized. Daisy reconsidered. "Perhaps not immediately," she amended. Breakfast passed pleasantly. Then Daisy asked the question, "How many servants remain at Blackthorne Hall?" Mrs. Finch set down her teacup. "Myself, Mrs. Hale, groundsman Logan Voss, stablemaster Tyler Ashcombe." Daisy blinked. "Only 4? His Grace reduced the household." Reduced, an interesting word. Blackthorne Hall required at least 30 servants, possibly 40. 4 was not reduction. It was surrender. Daisy looked around the kitchen. Everyone seemed tired, resigned, as if they had forgotten what a functioning household looked like. "What happened here?" Daisy asked quietly. Mrs. Finch became very still. Long experience had taught Daisy that stillness often concealed pain. 7 years ago, Mrs. Finch said carefully, the Duchess died. Silence. And afterward, the Duke stopped coming home. Simple words. Devastating truth. Daisy lowered her gaze. "How often does His Grace visit?" Mrs. Finch stared into her tea. "He has not spent more than 3 nights here in 7 years. 7 years. Daisy thought of the stopped clock, the shuttered windows, the locked rooms. Grief had not merely visited Blackthorne Hall, it had moved in permanently. After breakfast, Daisy requested the household ledgers. Mrs. Finch looked bewildered. "The accounts?" "Yes." "Would you not prefer to unpack?" "No." "The gardens?" "No." "Your wardrobe?" Daisy smiled politely. "Accounts first." Mrs. Finch studied her, exactly as she had the previous day, as though attempting to understand what manner of woman had arrived at Blackthorne Hall. "The ledgers are in the library." The library proved magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, rolling ladders, mahogany desks, dust, so much dust. Sunlight barely penetrated because every curtain remained drawn. Daisy crossed directly to the nearest window. She opened the curtains. Sunlight flooded the room. Dust particles danced. The transformation was immediate, extraordinary. The room breathed. Behind her, Mrs. Finch made a distressed sound. "Your Grace." "Yes?" "His Grace preferred them closed." Daisy looked around. "No." Mrs. Finch frowned. "Pardon?" "He preferred grief." Silence. Daisy rested one hand against the window frame. "The room prefers sunlight." She opened the remaining curtains. By noon, every window in the library stood open. Fresh air moved through the room. Mrs. Finch watched the proceedings with visible unease. But she did not stop her. An important distinction. Daisy spent 3 hours reviewing estate accounts. By the end of those 3 hours, she had learned 3 things. First, Blackthorne Hall remained enormously wealthy. Second, expenditures were strangely inconsistent. Third, no one had reviewed these records carefully for years. Interesting. Very interesting. She copied figures into a notebook, Page after page, pattern after pattern. Someone had been very comfortable, very confident, very certain nobody would ever ask questions. Daisy intended to ask many. By late afternoon, she ventured outside. The gardens lay beyond the terrace, or rather, what had once been gardens. Nature had reclaimed nearly everything. Roses climbed unchecked. Fountains sat dry. Stone paths disappeared beneath weeds. Yet beneath the neglect, beauty remained. Daisy could see it. Potential. Hope. Logan Voss, the groundsman, found her kneeling beside a rose bush. "Your Grace." He looked horrified. "You shouldn't be doing that." "Why?" "Because you're a duchess." Daisy looked at the rose. "It appears unaware of my title." Logan stared, then unexpectedly laughed. It was the first genuine laughter Daisy had heard inside Blackthorne Hall. An excellent beginning. "Can these gardens be saved?" she asked. Logan looked around. Hope flickered. "Yes." "Good. When would your Grace like us to begin?" Daisy pushed herself upright. "We begin tomorrow." Something changed in Logan's expression. Servants recognized many things. Among them, commitment. For the first time in years, someone intended to stay. That evening, Daisy explored farther. The east wing, the second floor, the long western corridor. And there, she found it, a heavy oak door, locked, unlike the others. No dust marked the handle. Someone cleaned this door, regularly, curious, very curious. She tried the handle, locked. Above the frame hung a small brass plaque, West Wing. Nothing more, no explanation. Just a locked wing in a grieving house. Mrs. Finch appeared behind her so suddenly Daisy nearly jumped. "Your Grace." Daisy recovered quickly. "What is in the West Wing?" Mrs. Finch's face drained of color. "It remains closed." "Why?" "By the Duke's order." "For 7 years?" "Yes." "Why?" Mrs. Finch looked away. "Some doors remain closed for good reason." Daisy looked back at the locked door. Some doors, some secrets, some griefs. "Very well," she said softly, but she did not forget. That night, as rain once again struck the windows, Daisy wandered through the entrance hall before retiring. The grandfather clock stood exactly where she had left it. Silent. Frozen. 8:11. Something about it bothered her. Deeply. She approached, ran her fingers along the carved wood, then paused. There, near the base, something gleamed. A narrow opening, almost hidden. Daisy knelt, reached inside, and withdrew a tiny silver key. She stared at it. The key was old, beautifully made, and engraved with a single letter, W. Above her, somewhere deep inside Blackthorne Hall. A floorboard creaked. Daisy slowly raised her eyes toward the dark upper floors, because she suddenly knew exactly which door the key belonged to, the West Wing, and someone, very clearly, did not want it opened. Daisy Charlton did not open the West Wing immediately. Curiosity, she had learned long ago, was a valuable servant and a dangerous master, and Blackthorne Hall had already demonstrated a distinct talent for unsettling her. So she placed the silver key inside the pocket of her dress, retired to bed, and attempted to sleep. Attempted. Unfortunately, the West Wing had followed her upstairs. It lingered in her thoughts. The locked door, Mrs. Finch's expression, the letter W engraved upon the key, and above all, the certainty that someone had hidden that key inside the grandfather clock for a reason. By morning, Daisy had reached a conclusion. Secrets did not improve with age. They simply grew teeth. She dressed quickly. At breakfast, Mrs. Finch seemed distracted, nervous, almost watchful. Daisy suspected she knew about the missing key. Interesting. Very interesting. "Mrs. Finch," Daisy said pleasantly. "Yes, Your Grace." "How long have you worked at Blackthorne Hall?" 38 years. "You must know every room." A pause. "I know most of them." Daisy buttered her toast. "And the West Wing?" Mrs. Finch nearly dropped her teacup. The silence that followed was eloquent. That wing remains closed. So you said. It should remain closed. Why? Mrs. Finch lowered her gaze. Because some sorrows deserve privacy. Daisy said nothing. She had discovered something important. Mrs. Finch was protecting the West Wing, but she was also afraid of it. Those were not the same thing. After breakfast, Daisy threw herself into work. She instructed Logan to begin clearing the southern gardens. Tyler was dispatched to inspect the abandoned stables. Mrs. Hale reluctantly agreed to reopen the formal dining room. Blackthorne Hall stirred, slowly, cautiously, like a sleeping giant uncertain whether it wished to wake. By late afternoon, Daisy found herself once more standing before the West Wing door. Sunlight filtered through distant windows. Dust drifted lazily. The house was silent. She removed the silver key. The engraved W gleamed softly. For one absurd moment, Daisy almost apologized to the door. Then she inserted the key. The lock opened instantly, as though it had been waiting. The sound echoed down the corridor. Heavy. Final. Daisy pushed. The door moved inward. Cold air spilled into the hallway. Air untouched for years. The West Wing smelled faintly of lavender and grief. The corridor beyond was beautiful and heartbreaking. Everything remained exactly as it had been left. 7 years earlier, portraits still hung. Fresh flowers no longer occupied crystal vases. Dust coated every surface. Yet unlike the rest of Blackthorne Hall, nothing here had deteriorated. Someone maintained it. Carefully. Faithfully. Daisy walked slowly. Every room remained closed, until she reached the final door. This one stood slightly open. Sunlight entered through a single uncovered window. Daisy pushed gently and stopped. It was a nursery, a perfect nursery. Time collapsed. Tiny shoes rested neatly beside a painted rocking horse. A cradle stood near the fireplace. Books remained arranged upon shelves. A small knitted blanket lay folded in a chair. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been moved. The room had become a memorial. Daisy stepped inside. Her chest tightened. Because this was not merely a nursery. It was a room abandoned in the middle of love. She crossed slowly to the cradle. A silver mobile still hung above it. Moon, stars, clouds, waiting for hands that had never reached for them. Daisy touched the edge of the cradle. Dust had been removed recently. Someone still came here. Mrs. Finch, of course. The old housekeeper had been keeping vigil for 7 years. A sound behind her made Daisy turn. Mrs. Finch stood in the doorway. Her face was pale. You opened it? Daisy nodded gently. Yes. Mrs. Finch looked around the room. The older woman's eyes shone. His Grace ordered it sealed. Why? Mrs. Finch entered slowly. I suppose, she said softly, because if he closed the door, he would not have to remember. Daisy looked around. But he remembered anyway. Mrs. Finch closed her eyes. Every day. Silence settled. Soft. Painful. Whose nursery was this? Daisy asked quietly. Mrs. Finch stared at the cradle. Lady Amelia Ellis. The Duke's daughter. Yes. Daisy frowned. Was? Mrs. Finch looked away. The child died. The answer came too quickly. Prepared. Practiced. Daisy felt it immediately. There was something missing. Something wrong. Along with the Duchess? Mrs. Finch nodded. The former Duchess died shortly after childbirth. And the baby? Another pause. Yes. Daisy waited. Nothing more came. Strange. Very strange. Because grieving households spoke differently. They remembered. Dates. Circumstances. Stories. Mrs. Finch offered none. Only silence. Daisy let the matter rest. For now. She continued exploring. Inside a small cabinet beside the fireplace, she discovered carefully preserved toys. Wooden blocks, stuffed animals, tiny silver rattles, and among them, a leather-bound memory book. Daisy hesitated, then opened it. The first pages contained nursery notes, feeding schedules, sleeping habits, measurements, Observations written in elegant feminine handwriting, almost certainly Duchess Evelina's. Daisy turned another page, then froze. There were entries documenting Lady Amelia's development. Month 1, month 3, month 6, month 12, month 18. Daisy blinked, confused. The child had supposedly died during childbirth. Why did the journal continue for 18 months? Slowly, she turned additional pages. The final entry had been written 7 years earlier. Amelia took 6 steps today. Charles nearly cried. Daisy stared. 6 steps. A child taking first steps. A living child. Not a stillborn infant. Not a newborn who died alongside her mother. A child. A child old enough to walk. The room suddenly felt very cold. Mrs. Finch saw her expression. "What is it?" Daisy handed her the journal. Mrs. Finch read the page. All color disappeared from her face. "No." The word emerged as a whisper. "No, no, no." "Mrs. Finch." The older woman sank into a chair, hands trembling. "You were never meant to find this." Daisy's heart began to race. What happened here? Mrs. Finch looked toward the window, toward distant gardens, toward the years between then and now. "When Her Grace died," she whispered, "everything changed." "Mrs. Finch." But the housekeeper shook her head violently. "I cannot." "You can." "No. Please." Mrs. Finch rose abruptly. "There are things His Grace must tell you himself." Then she left, almost fled. Daisy remained alone in the nursery. The journal rested open in her hands. Lady Amelia had lived, at least for 18 months. Yet everyone believed she had died. Impossible. Unless someone wanted people to believe it. Daisy's pulse quickened. She closed the journal, and that's when she noticed the portrait. It hung above the mantel, a family portrait. Charles, Evelina, and between them, a little girl. Dark curls, bright smile, no older than 2. Daisy stepped closer. The painter's signature occupied the lower corner. Alongside the date, she read it once, then again, and a third time, because the portrait had been painted 6 years ago, 1 year after Lady Amelia had supposedly died. Daisy felt the room tilt. A child declared dead, a nursery preserved, a memory journal documenting 18 months of life, and now a portrait painted after the child's supposed death. Someone had lied. The question was who and why. That evening, Daisy locked the nursery herself. She kept the silver key, and she took the journal, because instinct told her something undeniable. Blackthorne Hall was not merely hiding grief, it was hiding a crime. And somewhere beyond the rain-soaked walls of the estate, someone had spent 7 years making certain the truth remained buried. Daisy Charlton did not sleep. Not truly. She lay awake beneath the heavy canopy of her bed while rain whispered against the windows of Blackthorne Hall, and one impossible thought repeated itself endlessly inside her mind. Lady Amelia Ellis had lived. The evidence sat locked inside the drawer of her writing desk. A nursery journal, a family portrait, a timeline that simply did not make sense. And somewhere in this vast, grieving house, someone had spent 7 years ensuring that nobody asked questions. Questions such as, what had happened to the Duke's daughter, and why had everyone agreed never to speak of it? Shortly before dawn, Daisy rose. She lit a lamp, unlocked the desk, and spread the nursery journal across the table. She read every page, twice. By sunrise, she had discovered something else. The final entry regarding Lady Amelia had been written exactly 7 years earlier, 3 days before Duchess Evelina's death. Then, nothing. No mention of the child's illness, no mention of a funeral, no mention of mourning arrangements, simply silence. Silence, Daisy had discovered, was often more revealing than words. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Grace?" "Mrs. Hale." "Come in." The cook entered carrying tea. She hesitated when she noticed the papers spread across the desk. "You're working early." "I prefer mornings." Mrs. Hale smiled faintly. Blackthorne Hall used to wake early. Used to? The older woman nodded. The late Duchess loved mornings. She used to walk the gardens before breakfast. She smiled sadly. His Grace always followed her. Daisy looked up. He did? Oh, yes. Mrs. Hale's expression softened. People forget now, but there was a time when Duke Charles scarcely let her out of his sight. A pause. They were very happy. The words lingered long after Mrs. Hale departed. Very happy, until suddenly they were not. Interesting. After breakfast, Daisy requested access to the estate's financial records. Again. Mrs. Finch looked alarmed. You reviewed them already? Yes. And? Daisy smiled. I should like to review them properly. Mrs. Finch wisely asked no further questions. By 10 o'clock, Daisy sat once more inside the library. Sunlight streamed through windows she had opened. Fresh flowers from the recovering gardens now occupied the desks. The room no longer resembled a mausoleum. It resembled a library. Progress. Daisy opened the ledgers and began reading, carefully, methodically, hour after hour, columns, figures, transactions, receipts, payments, patterns. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. At second glance, less so. Estate income from Blackthorne timber holdings had declined dramatically over 7 years, yet neighboring estates had prospered. Land rents had fallen, agricultural profits had shrunk, maintenance expenses had increased. Strange, very strange. Daisy began making notes. Names appeared repeatedly, particularly one, Harvey Ashcombe and Sons Estate Management. Quarterly payments, substantial payments, every 3 months, for 7 years. Daisy frowned. She searched for the contracts authorizing those payments. There were none, not a single signed agreement, no correspondence, nothing. Someone had been removing money from Blackthorne Hall without documentation, large amounts of money, for years. Daisy sat back slowly. There was an old saying her father had taught her. Numbers always tell the truth. People merely rearrange them. Someone had rearranged quite a lot. A shadow moved outside the library window. Daisy looked up immediately. Nothing. Only gardens, wind, trees. She returned to the ledgers. 10 minutes later, she felt it again. That peculiar sensation. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. Daisy rose, crossed to the window, looked outside. Still nothing. Yet instinct persisted. Someone had been standing there, watching her. The feeling remained all afternoon. By evening, Daisy had filled 20 pages of notes, and she had reached a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Blackthorne Hall was being robbed, systematically, patiently, and very professionally. Someone had spent years draining the estate. The next morning brought visitors. Unexpected visitors. Mrs. Finch appeared in the breakfast room looking deeply displeased. Mr. Harvey Rook has arrived. Daisy looked up. Who is Mr. Rook? The estate solicitor. Interesting, very interesting. Please show him in. Harvey Rook proved younger than expected, perhaps 35, tall, dark-haired, exceptionally well-dressed. His expression suggested permanent skepticism. He bowed. Your Grace. Mr. Rook, I understand His Grace informed London that you had assumed responsibility for household matters. Daisy noticed his careful wording. Household matters, not estate matters. Among other things, she replied. His eyes sharpened. Indeed. Tea arrived. Conversation began politely. It remained polite for exactly 11 minutes. How long have you represented Blackthorne Hall? Daisy asked. 8 years. Then perhaps you can explain certain irregularities within the estate accounts. Silence. Mr. Rook set down his teacup. What irregularities? Daisy slid several pages across the table. He read. His expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. You've reviewed the financial ledgers? Yes. Extensively? Yes. Another pause. Longer. Most duchesses concern themselves with charitable committees. Daisy smiled. Most duchesses have not spent years balancing shipping accounts. For the first time, Harvey Rook looked genuinely interested. "Your father was Edmund Charlton?" "Yes, I knew of him." "So I've heard." Harvey studied the figures again. Finally, he spoke quietly. "You are correct." Daisy went still. "About what?" "Blackthorne revenues should be significantly higher." He lowered his voice. "I raised concerns several years ago." "You did?" His Grace declined to discuss estate affairs. There was no accusation in his tone, only regret. "Why?" Harvey looked toward the window. "Because after the Duchess died, His Grace stopped caring whether Blackthorne prospered." The words struck Daisy unexpectedly hard. Stopped caring. No, she thought, not stopped caring. Stopped surviving. There was a difference. Harvey continued. "Lord Percival Vale currently oversees most estate management." Daisy's eyes narrowed. "Who is Lord Percival Vale?" "His Grace's cousin." "Interesting. Very interesting indeed. And does Lord Percival benefit from these irregularities?" Harvey hesitated. That hesitation told Daisy everything. Before she could press further, a servant entered. "Your Grace, there is a gentleman asking for Lord Vale." Daisy exchanged a look with Harvey. "Show him in." The man who entered wore expensive clothes and an unpleasant smile. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Daisy. "Your Grace, good morning. I had expected Lord Vale. I'm afraid he is not in residence." The man recovered quickly. "Of course." He attempted to leave. Daisy stopped him. "Your name?" "Page Armitage." Another interesting hesitation. "Your business with Lord Vale?" "Private." Harvey Rook stood. "Mr. Armitage, I was unaware you conducted business with Blackthorne Hall." The man visibly paled. "Merely social." Then he left, quickly, very quickly. Harvey watched him go. He should not have been here. Why? Because Mr. Armitage purchases timber. Silence. Daisy slowly looked toward the library, toward the ledgers, toward 7 years of disappearing profits. "They're connected," she whispered. Harvey met her gaze. "Yes." Daisy felt something cold settle inside her. The theft, the missing money, the false accounts, the hidden child. Nothing at Blackthorne Hall was accidental. Someone had been building lies here for years, and whoever it was had just realized Daisy Charlton was asking questions. That night, exhaustion finally overcame her. She retired shortly after midnight. For the first time since arriving, she locked her bedroom door. Precaution seemed wise. The storm returned. Wind battered the house. Branches scraped windows. Somewhere, a clock struck 1. Daisy slept, then awakened instantly. A sound, soft, metal. Inside her room, she sat upright. The fire had died. Moonlight filled the chamber. At first she saw nothing. Then, movement. Near her writing desk, a figure dressed entirely in black. Daisy gasped. The intruder turned. For one terrible second, they stared directly at one another. Then the figure ran. Daisy leapt from bed. "Stop!" The intruder reached the balcony doors, vanished into darkness. Moments later, Mrs. Finch, Logan, and Tyler burst inside carrying lamps. "Your Grace!" Daisy pointed toward the desk. The drawer stood open. Papers scattered everywhere. The nursery journal remained. The portrait remained. But something was missing. Daisy looked down. Her heart sank. The page containing Lady Amelia's final entries had been stolen. Someone knew. Someone knew exactly what she had discovered, and someone was now afraid. The morning after the intrusion, Blackthorne Hall felt different. Houses, Daisy had discovered, possessed moods. Yesterday, the great manor had seemed merely sorrowful. Today, it felt watchful, alert, as though the house itself had finally realized that an enemy had crossed its threshold. Daisy stood in the library at 7 o'clock, staring at the empty space where the stolen journal page had been. Someone had entered her room. Someone familiar enough with Blackthorne Hall to move through it in darkness. Someone who knew precisely what to take. Not the entire journal. Not the portrait, only the final page. The page proving that Lady Amelia Ellis had lived, which meant only one thing. Someone had spent 7 years protecting a lie, and now that lie was threatened. Mrs. Finch stood opposite her. The older woman's face was grave. I have locked every exterior entrance. Good. Tyler rode the grounds at sunrise. He found no sign of forced entry. Daisy looked up. No sign at all? Mrs. Finch hesitated. Only footprints. Where? The West Terrace. Daisy's pulse quickened. Show me. The rain had softened the earth. Near the terrace steps, a single set of boot prints remained partially visible. Large. A man's boots. Recent. Logan crouched beside them. They came from the woodland, Your Grace. And returned there? No. He pointed toward the house. They came from the woodland. A pause. But they never went back. Silence. Daisy slowly looked toward Blackthorne Hall, toward its countless windows, toward corridors she had yet to explore. Someone had entered the estate grounds from outside, but they had left another way, perhaps through the house itself. An unpleasant thought, a very unpleasant thought. That afternoon, Daisy summoned the entire household. Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Hale, Logan, Tyler. The 4 remaining servants assembled in the dining room. For the first time in years, sunlight filled the chamber. Fresh flowers adorned the table. The room no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Daisy remained standing. Last night, someone entered my room. Shock rippled across every face. Mrs. Hale gasped. Tyler swore quietly. Mrs. Finch merely closed her eyes. I believe the intruder was searching for documents. Logan looked furious. You think someone from the village? No, Daisy interrupted gently. I believe this concerns Blackthorne Hall. The room became silent, very silent. Which means, Daisy continued, that until we understand what is happening, we must protect one another. She looked at each person individually. I know I arrived unexpectedly. Mrs. Finch shifted. I know His Grace left. No one spoke, but I also know this house matters to all of you. A long pause. I intend to remain. Something changed, small, but significant. Mrs. Hale's eyes filled with tears. Logan straightened. Tyler nodded once. And Mrs. Finch. Mrs. Finch finally smiled. It was brief, faint, but genuine. You sound very much like the late Duchess, she said softly. The words settled heavily over the room. Daisy was uncertain how to respond, so she simply said, Then she must have been remarkable. Mrs. Finch's smile trembled. She was. By the end of the week, Blackthorne Hall had transformed again. The dining room reopened. The music room reopened. Curtains came down. Windows opened. Fires burned. Mrs. Hale baked bread every morning. Flowers appeared throughout the house. Laughter slowly returned. Even the servants walked differently. Hope altered posture. Daisy noticed such things. The gardens flourished as well. Logan worked tirelessly. Together, he and Daisy reclaimed pathways lost beneath years of neglect. One afternoon, while clearing ivy from an abandoned stone wall, Logan uncovered something unexpected. A concealed iron door, half buried, rust-covered, forgotten. Have you ever seen this before? Daisy asked. Logan shook his head. No, Your Grace. Tyler arrived carrying tools. Together they forced the ancient door open. Beyond lay a narrow staircase descending beneath Blackthorne Hall. A tunnel. Cold air drifted upward. Mrs. Finch turned pale the moment she saw it. The old servant passage. You knew about this? Only stories. Mrs. Finch looked deeply unsettled. They were sealed decades ago. Daisy stared into darkness. A secret passage, leading beneath the house. A convenient route for someone wishing to move unseen. Interesting. Extremely interesting. That evening, Daisy returned to the estate accounts. Harvey Rook had sent additional financial records. The new documents confirmed her suspicions. Someone had diverted enormous sums, for years. But now, patterns emerged clearly. Every suspicious transaction connected to a single authority. Lord Percival Vale, Charles's cousin, estate trustee, financial advisor, family confidant. Daisy stared at the figures. 7 years, 7 years of theft, 7 years during which Duke Charles had remained absent. Someone had benefited enormously from his grief. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Harvey Rook entered carrying another ledger. "I found this among archived correspondence." He placed it before her. Daisy opened it and froze. It contained private estate reports, monthly reports, addressed directly to Duke Charles. Every report had been returned unopened, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Harvey spoke quietly. His Grace never read them. Daisy touched the unopened envelopes. So much loss, so much avoidance. No, not avoidance. Pain. Pain could become its own prison, and Charles Ellis had apparently sentenced himself to life imprisonment. Harvey watched her carefully. "Will you write to him?" Daisy looked up. "He would not come." "I believe he would." "Why?" Harvey hesitated. "Because no one has asked him to come home in 7 years." Silence. Daisy looked again at the unopened letters, the abandoned house, the grieving servants, the missing child, the stolen fortune, and suddenly she understood something. Charles Ellis had not abandoned Blackthorne Hall. Not entirely. Part of him had remained here, broken, waiting. She moved to the writing desk, pulled fresh paper toward her, and began. She wrote plainly, specifically, without sentiment, without accusation. "Your Grace, Blackthorne Hall requires your immediate attention. I have discovered substantial financial irregularities involving estate management over the past 7 years. I believe your trust has been exploited. There is also another matter." Daisy paused, looked toward the west wing, toward the nursery, toward the family portrait. Then she continued, "I have reason to believe certain events surrounding Lady Amelia's death require review." She stopped, read the letter, sealed it. Harvey accepted it silently. "Will he come?" Daisy asked. Harvey looked toward Blackthorne Hall. "I cannot say." A pause. "But if that letter does not bring him home, nothing will." 3 days passed, then 5, then 8. No reply. Life at Blackthorne Hall continued. The gardens bloomed. The music room filled once more with piano melodies. Mrs. Hale began preparing elaborate dinners despite having no guests. Hope had become habit. On the 9th evening, Daisy stood in the restored rose garden. Sunset painted the sky gold. She was pruning roses when Logan appeared. "Your Grace?" She looked up. He seemed unusually pale. "A carriage is coming." Daisy frowned. "From the village?" Logan shook his head. "No." He swallowed. "It carries the Blackthorne crest." Everything inside Daisy became suddenly still. At the end of the drive, emerging slowly between ancient oaks, appeared a magnificent black carriage. The Ellis crest gleamed upon its door. Mrs. Finch appeared beside Daisy. Her hands trembled. He came. No one moved. Servants emerged silently from every direction, watching, waiting, because after 7 years, the Duke of Blackthorne was finally coming home. The carriage stopped. The door opened. A polished boot touched gravel. Then another. And Duke Charles Ellis stepped out, tall, impeccably dressed, grayer somehow than in Daisy's memory, older, wearier. He lifted his eyes and looked at Blackthorne Hall. Really looked. For the first time in years, every shutter stood open. Golden light shone from every window. Flowers bloomed across the terraces. Music drifted faintly through open doors. Servants moved across the grounds. The house lived. Charles remained perfectly motionless, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze found Daisy standing among the roses, and for one long, impossible moment, he looked like a man who no longer recognized his own home. Duke Charles Ellis stood motionless beside his carriage. For several seconds, no one spoke. No one dared. The servants had gathered quietly on the front terrace. Mrs. Finch stood with her hands clasped tightly before her. Logan and Tyler waited near the stable yard. Even Mrs. Hale had emerged from the kitchen, Flower still dusting her apron. All of them watched their Duke, watched the man who had not truly come home in 7 years. Charles looked at Blackthorne Hall, and Blackthorne Hall looked back. The shutters were open, every one of them. Golden evening light spilled through windows that had remained dark for years. Fresh flowers lined the front steps. The neglected fountain in the center garden flowed once more, sunlight glimmering across moving water. Somewhere inside the house, someone was playing the piano, very softly, very beautifully. Charles did not move. Daisy stood among the restored rose bushes, pruning shears still in her gloved hand. She watched his face carefully. Shock was too small a word. What she saw was grief colliding with memory. The Duke looked like a man returning to a grave and finding a heartbeat. Finally, he spoke. "What happened here?" His voice was low, rough. Mrs. Finch stepped forward. "Your Grace." "No." Charles never looked away from the house. "What happened?" Daisy answered. "We opened the windows." At last he turned, really turned, and looked at her. The same gray eyes she remembered from their wedding. Beautiful, exhausted, but no longer empty. He studied her openly. The woman standing before him was not the uncertain bride he had left in a church months earlier. Daisy Charlton had changed. She stood straighter. There was color in her cheeks from working outdoors, confidence in her posture, purpose. The house had come alive, and somehow, so had she. "You reopened everything?" he asked quietly. "Not everything." She held his gaze. "Some rooms are still waiting." Something flickered across his expression. Pain, recognition, perhaps both. Mrs. Finch stepped forward. "Your rooms have been prepared, Your Grace." Charles nodded absently, but he did not enter immediately. Instead, he slowly walked toward the front doors. His hand brushed the stone banister, then the brass handle, almost reverently, as though touching a ghost. Inside, he stopped again. The entrance hall was warm. Fresh flowers occupied the central table. A fire burned, sunlight poured through uncovered windows, and the great-grandfather clock, the Duke, froze. "The clock," Daisy followed his gaze. "It works now." Charles stared. The hands moved steadily. Tick, 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 life, time, forward. Mrs. Finch looked away discreetly, because everyone in Blackthorne Hall knew what the stopped clock had meant. 7 years ago, when Duchess Evelina died, Charles himself had ordered it left untouched. Time had stopped for him that day. Now it moved again. Slowly, Charles crossed the hall. He touched the polished wood. "You repaired it?" "No," Daisy said softly. "I simply wound it." Silence settled, heavy, emotional. Then Charles looked around, really looked. The open curtains, the polished floors, the flowers, the warmth. And for the first time, Daisy saw something dangerous in his eyes. Hope. Because hope was dangerous for people who had spent years grieving. That evening, they dined together, alone. At opposite ends of the long dining table, 8 feet separated them, 8 feet, and an ocean of unspoken things. Charles finally set down his fork. "Your letter mentioned financial irregularities." "Yes." "And another matter." Daisy folded her hands. "Yes." Charles watched her. "Mrs. Charlton." "Daisy." He paused, the smallest pause. "Daisy." The sound of her name in his voice felt strangely intimate. What matter could possibly bring me back to Blackthorne Hall? Daisy met his gaze steadily. She had promised herself she would tell him immediately, no delays, no hesitation. "The matter concerns Lady Amelia." Every trace of color vanished from Charles's face. The room became utterly silent. Daisy continued gently, "I believe your daughter may not have died." For one terrible second, The Duke simply stared at her. Then he rose so abruptly his chair crashed backward onto the floor. "No!" The word came out like a wound. "Daisy," his voice broke. "Do not say things like that unless you are absolutely certain." Daisy held his shattered gaze. "I found evidence." Charles stood perfectly still, and in that moment, Daisy understood something with absolute certainty. The real mystery of Blackthorne Hall had only just begun. Charles Ellis did not sleep that night. Neither did Daisy. Long after dinner had ended, the Duke remained standing alone in the library, staring into the fire as though the flames might somehow explain the impossible. His daughter. Alive. The very suggestion had shattered something inside him. Daisy found him there shortly after midnight. He had not moved. The untouched glass of brandy beside him remained exactly where Mrs. Finch had left it. "You said you found evidence," Charles said quietly, never taking his eyes from the fire. Daisy placed the nursery journal carefully on the desk between them. "I found this in the West Wing." For the first time, Charles looked at her. The West Wing. It was locked. A shadow crossed his face. "I locked it myself." Daisy said nothing. Slowly, Charles approached the desk. His hands trembled as he opened the journal. For several minutes, silence filled the library. He read every page. Then he reached the final surviving entry. "Amelia took 6 steps today." Charles nearly cried. The Duke closed his eyes. Daisy saw tears gather immediately. "She wrote this," he whispered. "Evelina wrote this." His voice broke completely. Daisy looked away, giving him privacy. Some grief deserved witnesses, others deserved dignity. Several minutes passed before Charles spoke again. "My daughter was 18 months old when Evelina died." Daisy stared. 18 months? Charles nodded slowly. "Amelia survived childbirth. She lived for a year and a half." He looked toward the fire. Then, one night, both of them became ill. Silence. "Evelina died before sunrise." His jaw tightened. "The physician told me Amelia died several hours later." Daisy felt cold. "Did you see her?" Charles looked up. "What?" "Your daughter." A long pause followed. "No." The answer came quietly. "I couldn't." Daisy understood immediately. Grief had prevented him. Someone had used that grief. "Who arranged the funeral?" she asked. Charles frowned. "My cousin, Lord Percival Vale." There it was. Again. Percival. Always Percival. Daisy moved to the writing desk. From a locked drawer, she removed the family portrait from the nursery. She handed it to him. Charles stared. Confusion crossed his face. Then shock. This portrait. He looked at the date and went completely still. It was painted 6 years ago. Daisy nodded. 1 year after Amelia supposedly died. Silence crashed into the room. "No." Charles shook his head. "No." But even as he spoke, Daisy saw realization begin. Slow. Terrible. "Someone lied to me," he whispered. Before Daisy could answer, a knock interrupted them. Mrs. Finch entered. One look at Charles told her everything. He knows. The old housekeeper closed the door softly. Then she did something unexpected. She sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. "Mrs. Finch," Charles said quietly, "tell me the truth." The older woman wept. For several moments she could not speak. When she finally did, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I never saw Lady Amelia buried." Charles froze. "What?" "I saw the small coffin." Tears streamed down her face, but it remained closed. The Duke looked as though he could no longer breathe. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mrs. Finch sobbed softly. "Because Lord Percival said it would destroy you." Silence. "He said the physician had already confirmed the child's death." She looked directly at Charles, and I believed him. The Duke turned away. Pain radiated from him, raw, unbearable. Daisy suddenly understood. Charles had abandoned Blackthorne Hall because he believed he had lost everything: his wife, his daughter, his future. But what if he had only lost one of them? A terrible possibility, and yet a hopeful one. Charles finally faced them. His expression had changed. The grief remained, but something new existed alongside it: determination. "If Amelia lived," he said quietly, "someone took her." Daisy nodded. "Yes." "And if someone took her?" He looked toward the dark windows of Blackthorne Hall. "We're going to find her." At that exact moment, thunder shook the house, and somewhere deep within Blackthorne Hall, a door slammed. All three of them turned, because footsteps were now running through the corridor outside the library. Fast, panicked. Someone had been listening, and they were trying to escape. The footsteps did not get far. Tyler intercepted the intruder near the servants' staircase. By the time Charles and Logan reached the corridor, a young maid named Elspeth stood trembling against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean any harm," she sobbed. "Please don't dismiss me." Charles stared at her. "Who sent you?" The girl hesitated. Daisy stepped forward. "Elspeth, if you tell us the truth, no one here will harm you." The maid burst into fresh tears. "Lord Percival." Silence. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. "He paid me," Elspeth whispered, "only to write letters, to tell him what happened inside the house. He said his grace would never return and that it was simply a state business." Charles went completely still. "How long?" 7 years. Mrs. Finch gasped softly. 7 years. 7 years of grief. 7 years of theft. 7 years of betrayal. And all of it had happened under the protection of family. The next morning, Harvey Rook arrived with devastating news. "We found her." Charles nearly overturned the breakfast table. "What?" Harvey smiled for the first time since Daisy had met him. "A former governess living in Whitcomb by the Sea has been receiving substantial anonymous payments for years." He paused. "She is raising a little girl named Amelia." No one spoke. No one dared. By sunset, Charles and Daisy were on the road. The coastal village appeared just before dusk. A small cottage overlooked the sea. Children played outside, and among them was a little girl with dark curls and unmistakable gray eyes. Charles stopped walking. The world seemed to stop with him. The child looked up. She could not have been older than 8. Beautiful, bright, alive, very much alive. She smiled politely at the strangers. Then she looked directly at Charles. Something changed. Children recognized love instinctively. "Are you my papa?" she asked softly. Charles broke, completely. He fell to his knees in the middle of the lane and began to cry. Years of grief, years of guilt, years of loneliness. Gone. The governess confessed everything. 7 years earlier, Lord Percival had ordered Amelia removed from Blackthorne Hall. If Charles died without an heir, Percival would inherit the dukedom. The physician had been bribed, the false death recorded, the child hidden. And Charles, shattered by Evelina's death, had never questioned what he could not bear to see. The scandal destroyed London society. Harvey and the Crown prosecutors moved swiftly. Percival was arrested, his estates seized, his name erased from every Blackthorne record. Newspapers called it the Blackthorne betrayal. But Daisy never cared about newspapers. She cared about people. 3 weeks later, Blackthorne Hall welcomed Amelia home. The house transformed instantly. Children possessed extraordinary gifts. Laughter returned. Running footsteps echoed through hallways. The nursery reopened, and for the first time in 7 years, joy lived openly inside Blackthorne Hall. One winter evening, Daisy stood in the restored rose garden beneath falling snow. She had almost convinced herself she was alone when Charles appeared beside her. He looked different now, lighter. Hope suited him. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Charles quietly said, "I owe you everything." Daisy shook her head. No. You gave me back my daughter. You found her. You brought me home. Silence. Snow drifted softly around them. Charles turned toward her fully. I married you because duty demanded it. Daisy lowered her eyes. I know. But I came back because of you. She looked up. Charles smiled. A real smile. Perhaps his first in years. You opened windows I had nailed shut. His voice grew softer. You brought life back to this house. A pause. And somehow, he gently took her hand. You brought me back with it. Daisy felt tears gather. Charles stepped closer. Stay with me, Daisy. She laughed softly through tears. I am your Duchess. No, Charles whispered. You are the heart of Blackthorne Hall. And beneath the falling snow, while warm light spilled from the windows behind them and Amelia's laughter echoed through the house, Daisy Charlton finally understood something extraordinary. Some people arrived in broken places, and instead of leaving, they taught those places how to live again. The end. If you enjoyed watching Daisy accidentally renovate an entire dukedom while solving a family conspiracy, don't forget to subscribe. Your support keeps us here. Join us for another unforgettable Victorian romance. Blackthorne Hall certainly refuses to stay quiet for long.